The PlayStation 2. I've had this console since the moment I was able to actually form memories in my big dumb baby brain, and I've loved it for the 20 plus years since its existence has been coded into my very soul. I have so many great memories with this console, like playing my dad's old PlayStation 1 games, becoming the raging Sonic fan I am nowadays because of the Sonic Mega Collection Plus, being completely engrossed in the worlds of Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, etc. and such. The funny thing about the PlayStation 2 though, it would continue to be my main console of choice even through the early 2010s when there were practically no games being developed and released for it, aside from shitty sports games that no one really cares about. This wasn't my decision, of course. I was aware that the PS3, Xbox 360, and the Nintendo Wii were all out at this time. But my family just never purchased any of those, so I just stuck with the PS2 and whatever used games my family would buy me once in a blue moon. Of course, I still collect PlayStation 2 games to this day, but obviously these are all purchased online or through some secondhand retro game stores where the games are all used. But I still remember the very last PlayStation 2 game I ever got factory sealed from a retail store. One day, my mom and I were out at a Walmart, and it was right before we were about to move to a new town. And I could have sworn I remembered seeing PS2 games in the video game section discreetly piled underneath some PS3 games behind the glass case in this specific Walmart. Some seriously Chad-like employee was chill enough to let me dig through, and sure enough, I was right. There were PS2 games buried underneath. And it was there that I saw Sonic Unleashed, the very last Sonic the Hedgehog game released for the PlayStation 2. Factory sealed in December of 2012. I already owned a copy of the game from eBay, but that disc was scratched and it would freeze during some of the unskippable cutscenes. Since I couldn't skip the cutscenes, I couldn't progress in the game. But with a fresh copy, that was suddenly possible, and so I pleaded with my mom to buy me the same game that she already bought me in the hopes that the disc would actually work this time. Thankfully, she got it for me, and I was able to enjoy the experience of opening up a factory-sealed PlayStation 2 game from a retail store one last time. But that got me to thinking, am I the only one who likes Sonic Unleashed? But then I actually got to thinking, Sonic Unleashed was the last PlayStation 2 game I bought sealed from a store. But what was the very last PlayStation 2 game released on the console? Well, that depends on your region. If you lived in Japan, it was an expansion for Final Fantasy XI, Seekers of Adoulin. It was released to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the launch of the game and included new job types and bosses. Seeing as the PS2 online functions officially ended in 2016, that means people only got to play this game on the PS2 for 3 years before the servers shut down. Interestingly, Final Fantasy XI would receive one more final update after Adoulin in 2015, but obviously for other platforms and not for the PS2. That said, if you own any physical disc of Final Fantasy XI on PS2, then that disc is essentially worthless unless you're holding onto it for strictly archival purposes. The PS2 servers have been down for years, and unlike other PS2 games that actually have fan-run revival servers, Final Fantasy XI is only playable on PC right now, and will probably always stay that way. And as far as the last PlayStation 2 game in Europe, it was, of course, a sports game. Pro Evolution Soccer 2014. I mean, hey, if you ever feel like playing the worst version of an annualized soccer game, then there you go crazy. Interesting thing is that it was released on November 8th, 2013, exactly 1 week before the PlayStation 4 launched. In the West, it was a similar thing, a typical soccer game. FIFA 14 was released in September of 2013, just 1 month before the PlayStation 4 launched. Although according to Wikipedia, it is only released in Spanish-speaking countries, so if you do find an NTSC copy, the box art will probably be in Spanish. While FIFA 14 was the last NTSC PlayStation 2 game, you could obviously get FIFA 14 on other, far better platforms, including even the PlayStation 4. Now that's a trip. Try playing the PS2 and PS4 versions of FIFA 14 back to back. That's the closest thing to time traveling the human race will ever achieve. In fact, there's a version of FIFA 14 for every PlayStation platform active at the time, including PS2, PS3, PSP, PS Vita, and the PS4. I'm pretty sure that means that FIFA 14 is the game released on the most PlayStation platforms within the same year, maybe even the most PlayStation platforms overall. I actually do own the last PlayStation 2 game released in English, specifically in North America, or at least one of them. According to Metacritic, FIFA 13 and Pro Evolution Soccer 2013 were both released on September 25th, 2012. They both top the all-time list of PS2 games when browsing them by date, so I'm pretty sure this means that these are the last two games released in North America. I own PES 2013 and yeah, it's pretty much what you would expect. Just another soccer game with an updated roster for the time. The most interesting thing to say about it is that it has ads for the PlayStation Vita in one of the playable fields. Let me be clear, the PS2 was around for so long that one of its games actually has advertisements for the PlayStation Vita, a successor to the PSP, which by that time had been available in North America for almost 8 months. I don't know, from a historical perspective, that's pretty mind-blowing. But then I got to thinking, what about exclusives? What was the last game released in North America that was specifically made for and only available on PlayStation 2? Well, I tried researching around, and that info isn't as easily available as you might think. I found a couple of forum pages, but nothing pointed me to a definitive answer. At the very least, I found a list on Wikipedia that listed every game that was currently available only on the PlayStation 2. Now mind you, this wasn't a list of PS2 exclusives, but games that have no other version than on the PS2, meaning games like Jak and Daxter were excluded from the list since you can currently get those on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. Although oddly enough, Parappa the Rapper 2 was still on the list, which is also available on the PS4, so I guess it's not entirely complete. Another really helpful resource was actually Metacritic, which had a complete list of every North American PS2 game released in chronological order. I realize this research isn't exactly super thorough or anything, so I encourage you to do your own research if the topic interests you. And if you find any info that contradicts mine, then feel free to make your own call-out video so we can have some classic back and forth YouTube drama. So, which title holds the distinctive privilege of being the last game to be made and released exclusively and specifically for the PS2? After hours of researching, I think I finally got the answer. Ladies and gentlemen, the last PlayStation 2 exclusive in North America is a three-way tie, depending on your arbitrary criteria. Let's start with this mouthful of a JRPG. Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner 2 Raido Kuzunoa vs. King Abaddon was released exclusively on the PS2 in North America on May 12, 2009. The game is a sequel to the equally ridiculously titled Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner Raido Kuzunoa vs. the Soulless Army, which was released 2.5 years earlier in October of 2006. From what I can tell, the game is a mix of turn-based and real-time JRPG combat. You run around in an arena and can dodge an attack in real time, but you can also pull up a menu and give commands to demons in your party. I'm assuming it's structured similarly to how the combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake was structured, but with Shin Megami Tensei's signature demon negotiation and summoning. What's interesting about this game, as well as its predecessor, is that only the battle arenas and character models are fully 3D, while the environments outside of battle are completely pre-rendered. That's right, pre-rendered 3D environments on a home console video game in 2009. You know, the same year fucking Uncharted 2 was released. I'd imagine that this must have made Devil Summoner 2 seem pretty dated from the very moment it came out. Like, I didn't know we were playing Final Fantasy VII or fucking Resident Evil 1. But I guess that's just part of the charm of being a late-era PlayStation 2 game. They're so oddball and nonsensical that they shouldn't even exist. And yet, games for a console years past its prime just keep coming out for whatever reason. And with pre-rendered environments, no less? Utterly wild. From what I can tell, the game was received well too, so damn, chalk it up to Atlas yet again. These guys could build a game with the budget of a ham sandwich on the fucking Commodore 64, and they would still find a way to turn it into a cult classic. The game was also released on PSN for the PlayStation 3 in 2014, so if you have a PlayStation 3 laying around and you want to play the last PlayStation 2 exclusive, get it before Sony pulls the plug on the PS3 for good. It's bound to happen any day now. Of course, if you want to play the game on real PS2 hardware, you can do that too. All you need to do is go to www.ebay.com, type in Devil Summoner 2 in the search bar, and cry. Cry for fucking hours. Anyway, I did say this game was a three-way tie, so which game is next? Well, that game would be DDR. Of course, it's DDR. Konami released a metric ton of DDR games for the PS2. More than any human being could ever want on their PS2. So of course, DDR X2 was released, only in North America, on October 27th, 2009, 5 months after Devil Summoner 2, making it the last PS2 exclusive in North America. Or so I thought. While yes, there was a PS2 game called Dance Dance Revolution X2 that released on the PS2 in 2009, there was another game called Dance Dance Revolution X2 released in arcades just over a year later in North America on December 31st, 2010. So technically it's not really a PlayStation 2 exclusive because it was also released in arcades. Now sure, arcades aren't really a relevant platform to be compared to consoles, but it does count, so that should disqualify it, right? Well, it turns out that the arcade version and the PS2 versions of DDR X2 are actually pretty different from each other. For one, the menus are slightly different, and the track lists are actually really different. Only 25 out of the 60 songs from the console version are in the arcade version, and the arcade version has a shit ton more songs than the console version does too. So does this still count as a PlayStation 2 exclusive if another version of it also released in arcades just over a year later? Since the game is not exactly the same as the arcade version, do they count as two separate games? I mean, they both have their own Wikipedia articles to distinguish between them after all, so if Wikipedia considers them separate games, should we? Really, it's all technicality and entirely dependent on what you think. Personally, I think the idea of the last PlayStation 2 exclusive in North America being a DDR game is pretty lame, so I'm going to spitefully not count it. If you're lame and you want to, then that's fine by me, but I'm considering the last PlayStation 2 exclusive to be Devil Summoner 2. Except, there's one more game that is worth talking about when discussing the last true PlayStation 2 exclusive. Sakura Wars So Long My Love is a mixed genre kind of experience. This part tactical JRPG, part visual novel, part dating sim was developed by Sega and Red Entertainment. The game is actually the 5th installment in the Sakura Wars series and was the first game in the series to get localized in the West. It was also the last Sakura Wars game to be released until a soft reboot of the series was released for the PlayStation 4 in 2019. Like Devil Summoner 2, the game actually received a lot of positive reviews when it was released on, and I am not kidding, March 30th, 2010 in North America. That's right, we finally reached the beginning of the next decade and we're still getting brand new, non-sports related PlayStation 2 games. But was it really a new game? Well, as far as North America was concerned, it was. But Sakura Wars So Long My Love was actually announced all the way back in 2002 in Japan, and was released in July of 2005 over there as well. So us Americans were actually playing a 5-year-old PS2 game that was only just getting a localization in 2010. But hey, it only released on the PS2 in Japan, and I'm only counting North American release dates, so that should settle it, right? Well, not quite. While Sakura Wars So Long My Love was released on the PS2, publisher NIS America accurately predicted that no one was going to buy a PS2 exclusive that late into the console's lifecycle, except for the most hardcore of the hardcore. So they had Idea Factory port the game over to the Nintendo Wii, and release it on the exact same day as the PS2 version. here's where things get a little tricky. I originally stated that I wanted to find out which game was the last in North America that was made specifically to run on the PS2. Sakura Wars technically does follow that criteria. You see, while most late-era PS2 games were just downscaled ports of Wii games or upscaled ports of PlayStation Portable games, Sakura Wars is actually the opposite. It is a PS2 game from the ground up that got an enhanced re-release on the Nintendo Wii. In other words, instead of Sakura Wars on PS2 being a port of a Wii game, much like a lot of late-era PS2 games were, Sakura Wars on Wii is actually a port of the PS2 original. There were no compromises on the PS2 version when developing it for the Wii, because the game was developed on the PS2 first. So really, the Wii is just running a PS2 game instead of the PS2 running a Wii game. So does the fact that a Wii version just so happened to release on the exact same day disqualify it for being the last PS2 exclusive? You may disagree, and that's perfectly fine, but in my opinion, it does. From the perspective of your average North American consumer, it doesn't really matter that the game has been made for the PS2 first, or had already been out for 5 years prior in Japan. To us, the game just so happened to come out for both the Wii and PS2, and most people just bought the Wii version because it was a piece of hardware that wasn't a decade old by that point. Well, okay, unless you cared about the second bonus disc on the PS2 that had the Japanese voice acting, then you probably just picked it up on the Wii. Still, I do consider this whole scenario to be an interesting outlier, so I figured it was worth bringing up. So in my opinion, Devil Summoner 2 is the last PS2 exclusive released in North America. I salute you, Atlas, for making my console proud. So, in the year plus it's taken me to actually make this video, I realized that this game may also qualify as the last PlayStation 2 exclusive in North America. I mean, there's a small caveat to that, which, well, Mana Kamiya 2 Fall of Alchemy was released on the PS2 in North America on August 25th, 2009. Released after Devil Summoner 2, but before DDR X2, it's a JRPG published by NIS America and developed by Guest, a subdivision of Koei Tecmo Games, and is the 10th installment in the Atelier series of games. Am I pronouncing that right? I don't really know if I'm pronouncing that right. The game was only released in North America on PS2, but a PSP version was also released in Japan the same year, and it was most likely developed alongside the PlayStation 2 version. So while the game wasn't made specifically for the PS2 in its initial release window, I also said previously that to us North Americans, Japanese release dates shouldn't really matter. So if you lived in the US and saw Mana Kamiya 2 on the shelf for PS2 and nothing else, then yeah, that was the last time something like that was going to happen to you in the US. But again, a PSP version was always planned and fully developed and released alongside it. Does it count? Is it the last exclusive? The choice is yours, and yours alone. Although as far as I'm concerned, the last PS2 exclusive that actually matters is God of War 2. That game is a perfect send-off for this console. It is just so great. Seriously, go play God of War 2 if you have any appreciation for this era of gaming. It is incredible. Oh shit, wait, no, never mind. It's Persona 4. That game kicks ass too, possibly even more ass, and was released a year later. And considering how popular the Persona series is now, then yeah, I think I can consider that to be the PlayStation 2's last drawer. So I guess I'm saluting you again for a second time, Atlas, you brilliant bastard, you. But wait, you must be saying, probably hopefully, those were all third-party games. What about the very last PS2 games that were published by Sony themselves? Well, you needy little fucking freak, I've got you covered there too. In North America, the last Sony published PS2 game was MLB 11 The Show, released on March 8th, 2011. Not much to say about it, just another sports game. Although Wikipedia does note that it is actually missing features that were included in MLB 10 The Show, such as the bullpen meter that states whether or not a relief pitcher is warmed up. It also apparently doesn't feature analog control, which is especially bizarre. As for the last Sony published game on the PS2 overall, Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Dawn 2, the game. The game is a third-person shooter released for the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation Portable exclusively in India in February of 2013. It's based on the film of the same name, which was actually the second installment of the reboot of the Dawn action movie series. The game is horrendously awful, and I know because I actually played through the entire game. The boss fights are some of the most hilariously broken and unbalanced boss fights I have ever experienced in a video game before. The cutscenes and overall story are also pretty incoherent unless you've seen the movie, I guess, because the game certainly doesn't make me want to watch the movie to change my mind on that or anything. Although I will say I love the narrator for the cutscenes. The narrator is excellent.
Charuan, a Malaysian drug lord, double-crossed Dawn and had started dealing directly with the European mafia. Charuan had to pay, and Dawn was collecting.
He's especially great because not only is he the narrator, he's also the only voice actor for every single character in the entire game, apparently.
The warehouse where they packaged goods. You'll never get out of here alive, you Sylvester will hunt you down!
If you're looking for a hilariously bad game to play on a live stream or something, I suppose I could recommend Dawn 2, the game, for that at least. So am I done rambling about old-ass PS2 games that nobody cares about? Well, not quite yet. There are still a few more things that I really want to share. Remember that list of PS2-only games I was talking about? Well, there were a handful of games that I never knew about that blew my mind, and now I want to talk about them. Because I love rambling and I can't come up with an excuse to bring them up ever again after this, so let's go. The first game I want to talk about is this Cowboy Bebop game. I already knew about a Japanese exclusive Cowboy Bebop game for the PlayStation 1, but honestly, it didn't look very interesting to me. But then I found footage of this game and holy shit, it actually looks like the show. And it's a beat 'em up? With its own original story and new music tracks by the original show's composer? Holy shit, this game looks awesome! Apparently an English translation was planned at one point, but according to Did You Know Gaming's video on the game, it may have been cancelled due to the game's poor reception in Japan. That's a real damn shame, and to this day there isn't an English fan translation patch. Even if it isn't that great, I would love to play this game one day with English subtitles. Maybe someday, who knows. Vib Ribbon was a really charming PlayStation 1 game developed by Nana Onsha, the developers of Parappa the Rapper. It was a rhythm game like Parappa, but was unique in that you could insert any CD, and it would generate a level for the songs on that CD, so you could play the game with any song you want. That's honestly one of the coolest things I've ever seen a rhythm game do. And it's shocking that I haven't seen any other modern console rhythm games try something like that. Probably due to copyright reasons, which is a shame. Anyway, the PS2 got not only a Vib Ribbon spin-off title, but also a direct sequel. Moji Ribbon takes on an art style very similar to Okami and features slightly different rhythm-based gameplay. But Vib Ripple is an entirely different game from Vib Ribbon. To my understanding, it's not even a rhythm game, as you just bounce on photographs and collect stuff under a time limit. A little disappointing, honestly. I was really interested in a true Vib Ribbon follow-up. But hey, at least it uses the PlayStation Eye toy, the webcam peripheral for the PlayStation 2 that allowed you to take pictures and also play a small selection of motion-based video games. At least that's worth mentioning. You all remember Wacky Races, right? The Hanna-Barbera cartoon series? Well, apparently there were not one, but two Wacky Racer games released for the PlayStation 2, but they were both only in PAL regions. The first one, titled Wacky Races, starring Dastardly and Muttley, was actually released first on the Dreamcast in 2000, and then later PS2 in 2001. The second game was released in 2007, Wacky Races Mad Motors. Notice how I'm not saying that Mad Motors is a sequel to the first Wacky Races. They were actually developed and published by totally separate companies. Comparing the two games side by side, it's incredible how bad Mad Motors looks compared to the first game, even though Mad Motors was developed 6 years later. Mad Motors was clearly made for a cheap buck and not much else. What if I told you the National Rifle Association created a game for the special little gun enthusiast in your life? Introducing NRA Gun Club, released for the PS2 in October of 2006. In the game, you're basically in a shooting range, just shooting at targets. And that's literally it. I suppose it's trying to be a non-violent first-person shooter by showing the life of a responsible gun owner. I guess responsible gun owners just aren't allowed to listen to music while playing their video games, because there is zero music in the game at all. And I also guess that responsible gun owners don't like having fun, because from what I've seen, this game looks boring as hell. IGN went so far as to give it a 1.5 out of 10, citing the dullness of the gameplay and a lack of music. However, upon backing up my copy of the game to play it in an emulator, I noticed that there actually are music files on the disc, but it's never programmed to play during gameplay. I wasn't able to find this information anywhere online, so as a gift for making it this far into the video, here is a bit of the music of NRA Gun Club. Don't say I never did anything for you, alright? Now, as an American, I am 100% totally fine with lobbying our Congress members and showing complete apathy in response to mass shooting tragedies, but developing shitty video games is where I will unfortunately have to draw the line. Sorry, NRA, but I will now have to officially put you in the not cool category. Do better next time, guys. One last game I wanted to talk about. So you guys remember Seaman, right? For those unfamiliar, yes, the game is actually called Seaman. But not Seaman, but Seaman. Anyway, it's basically a sort of pet simulator that was released for the Dreamcast that was infamous for being super weird. And I mean really, really weird. I won't go into too much detail because the Angry Video Game Nerd has already made an entire video talking about it. So if you want to know more, I'd recommend checking out his video. But to my surprise, shock, and horror, not only did they port Seaman to the PlayStation 2 in Japan, but there actually exists a Seaman 2 exclusively for the PS2 in Japan, released a full 8 years after the original on the Dreamcast. Unlike the first Seaman, which was more of a pet simulator, Seaman 2 is more of a god game, where you have control over an entire island and its inhabitants. However, just like the first Seaman game, you communicate to your inhabitants using a microphone inside of the controller. Normally, the PS2 doesn't have a microphone in its controller, so they released a special controller that featured 6 face buttons and a built-in microphone just for this one game. They even had to remove the second analog stick to fit everything they needed into this thing. Honestly, as weird as this is, the idea of a controller with a built-in microphone must have been pretty impressive for the time. I mean, sure, the Nintendo DS had a built-in microphone, and even the PS5 has a controller with a microphone built in, but for the PlayStation 2, that must have been pretty impressive to see. Okay, I think I've rambled on long enough about the PlayStation 2, so I think I should just end the video here.